Iran Air has to be one of the most fascinating airlines on Earth. 50 years ago, they convinced Boeing, along with Pan Am, to build them a special variant of the Boeing 747, the 747 SP, where SP stands for Special Performance. The SP enabled Iran Air to serve New York non-stop from Tehran, a feat that was considered far-fetched just a decade earlier. The oil crisis of the early 70s made Iran very rich. The Shah went on a spending spree, investing $100 million in a German steel company and $200 million in the US aircraft manufacturer Grumman. Iran very nearly invested $300 million into Pan Am to prop them up after they got rocked by rising fuel prices in the mid-70s.
A Paris newspaper reported today that Pan American Airways has signed a preliminary agreement allowing interests in Iran to buy a majority of Pan Am stock.
That deal didn't go through, but Iran continued to collaborate closely with the West. Iran Air became a tremendous success story during this time. Sure, it was blessed to have the backing of a rich government, but it used the money wisely, generating consistent profits while growing its fleet and setting high standards for reliability, service, and safety. In fact, the safety record was so good that in 1976, Iran Air was ranked second in safety globally, only to Qantas, having been accident-free for 10 years running. That's pretty impressive, especially in an era where aircraft were far less safe and reliable than they are today. Consistent with his reputation for innovation, Iran Air ordered the Concorde in 1972. And it wasn't just for show. Iran was a serious buyer. So serious, they chartered the Air France Concorde numerous times while they waited for their own examples to be built. And I cannot imagine how crazy it must have been to fly supersonic from Tehran to Paris on an Iran Air ticket. Now, sadly, the political landscape started shifting in the late 70s, and Iran Air, being a government-owned airline, shifted as well. The airline scrapped its Concorde orders, not because it couldn't afford them, but because the Concorde was just too much a symbol of luxury and extravagance for an airline that wanted to be more affordable and accessible to its people. And in 1979, everything changed. And I mean everything. When the Ayatollah Khademi came to power, the US basically severed all relations with Iran, halting pretty much all trade, and this had a direct and devastating impact on the airline. They could no longer purchase new Boeing aircraft, they couldn't get replacement parts for their 747s, they couldn't conduct essential maintenance. Aircraft were grounded, flights were canceled, and Iran Air lost its reputation for quality and excellence. But the Iranian people don't like to be embarrassed. With no end to the sanctions in sight, they had to adapt, and they did. They couldn't buy Boeing, so they bought Airbus and Fokker. They found a way to procure parts, sometimes through a little bit shady transactions. They made their airplanes last forever. They operated the very last passenger 747-100, the very last passenger 747-200, and of course, the very last passenger 747 SP. When the Airbus A300 registered EPIBG was retired, it was 41 years old, the world's oldest active passenger Airbus. These aren't necessarily achievements to be proud of, but they do highlight the remarkable ingenuity and resilience of the country's commercial aviation sector. And we'll take a look at all the creative ways Iran has kept its fleet flying later in this series, but for now, let's rewind the clock all the way back to 1944. History buffs would know that we're in the throes of World War II, but most of the fighting was going on in Europe and the Pacific. Iran was officially neutral, but the country was occupied by the Allied forces and used as a critical supply route for Allied aid to the Soviet Union. It was at this time that Mohammad Reza Pahlavi came to power. He was just 22 years old at the time. The new Shah had his work cut out for him. The country was poor, infrastructure was lacking, and oil wealth was primarily controlled by foreign companies. Iran didn't really have control of its own country. However, the whole occupation did have one unexpected benefit: airports. The Allies built a ton of aviation infrastructure, much more than Iran could have built on its own at the time. Airports that were built or expanded during World War II include Tehran, Avaz, Abadan, Tabriz, and Andimeshk. Even though some of these airports weren't necessarily designed for commercial operations, they could be converted pretty easily, and this represented a huge opportunity. Enter a man named Reza Afshar. Mr. Afshar was an Iranian statesman who had also amassed considerable personal wealth through real estate holdings in Azerbaijan. Mr. Afshar was also a staunch nationalist, and it pained him that Iran didn't have an airline of its own. So he took action, founding Iranian Airways in 1944, along with entrepreneur Gholam Ebtihaj and a handful of other private investors. They cobbled together 50 million rials. It was a considerable gamble, considering none of them had ever run an airline. On the plus side, planes were cheap. There were a crap ton of C-47s laying around after the war, and Afshar also had some friends at TWA, so they were able to sketch out an efficient plan to train pilots and crew, many of whom were ex-Air Force. In 1946, Iranian Airways took flight on the roughly 500-mile route from Tehran to Mashhad. Within its first year, it built out quite a robust domestic network and also launched international flights to Cairo, Baghdad, and Tel Aviv. Paris was the first European destination and also the location of Iranian Airways' first office outside of Iran. The French were also instrumental in providing technical assistance to the young airline. However, despite support from more experienced foreign partners, Iranian Airways struggled with reliability and safety. Its reputation was scarred by 4 crashes in the early 1950s, and ultimately it was decided that operating a desirable international flag carrier was beyond the ability of the private sector. So Iran decided to nationalize its commercial airlines, taking Iranian Airways under its wing, along with a company called Persian Air Services. The two carriers were merged in 1961 to form the airline we now know as Iran Air. Iran Air adopted the Huma bird as its logo, a powerful symbol of fortune, kingship, and divine favor in Persian culture. This mythical bird is said to never come to rest, living its entire life flying invisibly high above the earth. In some interpretations, the Huma doesn't even have legs because, well, it doesn't need them. At first, the nearly 700 employees of the old Iranian Airways were skeptical. They thought the government takeover would hinder their progress, not help it. But the opposite ended up being true. The Shah took a keen interest in the aviation sector, partly because it would help Iran bolster its foreign credibility and sovereignty, but also because he was a pilot himself. He appointed a very capable leader to be Iran Air's first MD. This was a man named Ali Mohammad Khademi. Major General Khademi had a crazy good resume. He trained as an Air Force pilot, then he was the very first Iranian to get a commercial pilot license from the British Civil Aviation Authority. He'd occasionally captained planes for Iranian Airways, but arguably his biggest achievement was transforming the Iranian Air Force from a laughingstock into one of the most advanced and powerful air forces in the Middle East. He had a great ability to lay out a vision and then execute on it, which is exactly what the country's new flag carrier needed. And luckily, he wasn't starting from scratch. Iran Air already had a fleet. A small fleet, but a fleet nonetheless. It consisted of about 8 aircraft, primarily DC-3s, DC-6s, and a few Vickers Viscounts. Now, for those of you unfamiliar, those are all propeller planes, quite old technology at that point. The Viscounts were turboprops, but they alone weren't going to help Iran Air fulfill its grand global ambitions. For that, the Huma was going to need jets. Which jets? Well, it was a pretty easy choice. The gold standard for long-haul operations was the Boeing 707, so Iran Air ordered 707s, which would start arriving in 1965. For the short-haul operation, the 727 was the aircraft of choice. Ultimately, Iran Air wanted to operate an all-Boeing fleet with Pratt & Whitney engines. A very intentional and conscious decision by Lieutenant General Khademi to streamline training, operations, and maintenance. Fleet consistency, as they call it. The first wave of jets was sufficient to level up Iran Air's network and service. By the late 60s, they had expanded their network to 20 domestic and about 15 international destinations in the Middle East and Europe. First-class passengers on the 707 were treated to a multi-course Persian feast. Fresh, never frozen. as well as what they called an unbeatable brand of hospitality that goes back thousands of years. Alcohol wasn't available for religious reasons, a policy that continues today. But even without the champagne, it sounds like one heck of an experience, and I wish I could have been around to try it out myself. I know it's a long shot, but if any of you guys flew Iran Air in the 60s or 70s, please do share your stories in the comments. At any rate, come 1967, Iran Air was carrying about 400,000 passengers per year, almost 3 times the number it was carrying immediately after the merger in 1962. Ironically, part of the way it achieved this growth was by teaming up with other airlines. Iran Air had agreements with Air France, BOAC, Lufthansa, Swiss Air, and Aeroflot. These partnerships helped put Iran Air's name on the map, both literally and figuratively. Many foreigners probably had never heard of the airline until they booked a ticket with their normal carrier and ended up on Iran Air metal. Peter, how much did a ticket cost? And this is an interesting one. You could get domestic tickets for as little as $5.20. That's roughly $52 today. But if you wanted to get to Europe, but Paris or London specifically, you were looking at least $272 in economy. That's over $2,600 today. So air travel clearly wasn't really affordable for the common man, especially internationally, but there were plenty of government officials, foreign diplomats, oil executives, and other wealthy individuals that needed Iran Air's services. Iran also had a growing upper middle class that would fly the airline for leisure trips about once or twice a year, but this was a smaller portion of the overall demand. What really set them up for success was their solid marketing. They really leaned into the fact that Iran was a land of history, culture, and hospitality, which attracted foreign tourists and ultimately made it one of the hottest destinations in the Middle East. Depending on what metric you look at, the airline basically tripled or quadrupled in size from 1960 to 1970. Passengers quadrupled, while the fleet size and number of employees tripled. Did they profit every single year? I'm not sure. Probably not, but they also weren't taking the government's money and lighting it on fire either. Lieutenant General Khademi ran a pretty tight ship, and his success during the 60s only further fueled his ambitions. Priority number 1 for the new decade was spreading their wings further than just the Middle East and Europe. New York made a lot of sense, given Iran's close political and economic ties with the US at the time. Service was originally launched in 1971 with the 707, but it wasn't an ideal plane for the route. It needed to stop to refuel, and it couldn't carry a ton of passengers. Plus, Iran Air just wasn't going to stand out competitively with the single-aisle quadjet. Boeing's new jumbo, the 747, was bigger, it was more prestigious, and it could carry more passengers further without stopping. Iran Air started operating 747s as early as 1971, but those were wet leased from Pan Am and they still couldn't make it to New York non-stop. This frustrated General Khademi, so much so that he got Boeing to design a new version basically just for Iran Air. Well, not only for Iran Air, but one could argue that if Iran Air didn't push for it, it wouldn't have happened. This was the 747 SP, a shortened version of the 747 that kept the same wingspan and fuel volume as the original variants. It flew longer and faster, and it was capable of doing so even with Tehran's unique operational constraints, high altitude and brutal summer heat. It was a very niche plane. Only 45 were ever built, with Pan Am, South African Airways, and Iran Air being the largest operators. Iran Air ultimately took delivery of 4 of these birds, beginning in 1976, and they were tremendously successful. Tehran to New York was, for a period, the world's longest commercial non-stop flight, which brought a ton of prestige and positive publicity to Iran's airline. So, with the New York problem solved, Iran Air set out to execute on another key part of its strategy, building a gateway between East and West. Tehran was a highly strategic location, basically halfway between Europe and Asia, so if they played their cards right, Iran Air could capture demand from London to Tokyo, Paris to Beijing, all while boosting Iran's profile as a hub in and of itself. This ad made a pretty compelling case for a stopover in Tehran, enjoy the delights of modern Iran, see 2,500 years of history, and make valuable new business contacts? Sign me up. But travelers didn't need much convincing. It was just a matter of getting the word out that Iran Air even existed. So in addition to its catchy ads, the company had sales offices in 37 cities, even ones they didn't yet serve directly. Before mobile phones and the internet, One of the easiest ways to capture eyeballs was plopping a store in a high foot traffic location. The carrier's Paris office was located on the Champs-Élysées right between the Arc de Triomphe and the Place de la Concorde. The London office was in Piccadilly, right across from the Ritz Hotel. For a while, it proudly displayed a model of the Concorde in Iran Air colors. By juicing all its various sales channels, newspaper ads, TV ads, brick-and-mortar storefronts, airline partnerships, and word of mouth, Iran Air became the world's fastest-growing airline, at least by their own account. And if these stats are true, I don't think that claim can be disputed. By 1979, immediately before the revolution, Iran Air was carrying just under 5 million passengers per year. Remember, in 1970, they carried just 600,000, so that's an average growth rate of about 30% per year. The airline now had about 5 times as many employees, around 12,000. The fleet only grew by about 10 aircraft, but Iran Air was buying bigger planes, so their capacity grew pretty significantly. One of those bigger planes was the Airbus A300. Why the A300? I thought you said they were buying all Boeing. Well, see, Iran Air needed higher density aircraft for its regional routes to meet demand, and Boeing didn't really have a good solution for that yet. So Iran Air acquired 6 of the type before the revolution, with more to come later, and it would become a backbone of the fleet well into the 2000s. Going into 1979, Iran Air was firing on all cylinders, but their success didn't reflect the reality for the majority of people in Iran. People were really fed up with the Shah. They viewed him as elitist, dishonest, and corrupt. The fact he was basically installed by and propped up by Western governments didn't sit well with Iranians either. Oil profits flowed primarily to the ruling class, with the Shah's family and friends amassing vast wealth, while ordinary Iranians were left in the dust. Shiite Muslims were especially angry because one of their leaders had been expelled by the Shah's government. This was, of course, the Ayatollah Khademi. Khamenei's exile only amplified his influence. Not everyone agreed with the Ayatollah's exact religious vision, but he embodied the perfect symbol of resistance at a time when almost all Iranians were frustrated with the Shah's regime. Protests had been going on for a while, but what many considered to be the final straw was Black Friday, when the army fired upon peaceful protesters in Jaleh Square. Just months after, the Shah fled Iran and the Ayatollah Khamenei returned. He was greeted by one of the largest crowds ever assembled in Middle Eastern history. 3 million people from virtually every social class: clerics, bazaar merchants, teachers, students, nationalists, civil servants, young professionals, you name it. There was crying, chanting, shouting, praying. It was pretty obvious that people wanted this guy as their leader. So by the end of 1979, Iran became an Islamic republic, and this came with it immense change for the country's airline. First off, General Khademi was out. He had actually left prior to the revolution, kicking off a series of management changes that would create instability and uncertainty for the airline. Most of the Shah-era management either fled or were expelled. The airline lost a good number of senior pilots and engineers. For the employees who remained, plenty of good ones by the way, they were faced with a very difficult new reality. Iran Air had to pretty much shelve its growth plans. It was now in survival mode, cut off from the world it used to operate in. Forget about new planes, new international routes, new partnerships. The airline had to figure out just how to keep its current Western-built planes in the air. The airline changed its name to Iran Air, the airline of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Cabin crew, notably females, had to abide by a new dress code: long sleeves, pants, and hijab. Now, fair warning, from here on out, the story is a little less clear. There isn't much in the history books about Iran Air during the Khomeini regime. Operating statistics are few and far between, probably an intentional move by the new government. Many reports are only in Persian, but what is clear is the following. If this video was a story of global ambition and growth, part 2 will be more of a story of isolation and survival, but it will also be a story of resilience and triumph in the face of adversity. So in my opinion, almost equally as exciting as the airline's first chapter. But I'm going to leave things there. Hope everyone enjoyed the first installment. Thanks for tuning in, and I wish you all the safest and happiest of travels this holiday season. So long.